there's this feeling in Israel that sort of the red lines have been crossed in
Mhm.
terms of Israel's attacks in Lebanon. It's really hitting in the Dakhia and Beirut. It's doing things that it wouldn't have done before. Hezbollah has deepened its attacks in retaliation, but still is saying that it's hitting military targets. So it hasn't escalated as much, which what seems to be, some sort of signaling to avoid a larger war. With Israel, it's hard to know what's coming next. We have to see. Just on Friday, we had a huge strike that killed Ibrahim Akil, a top Hezbollah leader.
Israeli President Isaac Herzog has just said this morning that his country does not want war with Lebanon and insisted that it is fighting for its existence. Hezbollah and Israel exchanged rocket fire earlier this morning in one of the most intense skirmishes since the war in Gaza began nearly a year ago. Now, the Israeli military has said that it hit 290 targets inside Lebanon after Hezbollah launched more than 100 rockets at northern Israel. Well, joining us now is Anat Peled, Wall Street Journal correspondent, speaking to us from Tel Aviv. Anat, thanks for giving us your time.
Thanks for having me.
Anna, can you tell us the latest on the ground? Hezbollah have been firing about 100 rockets into northern Israel, and there's been some casualties.
Yeah, so we've had dozens of warplanes that have struck southern Lebanon on Saturday night and into Sunday morning. And then we had also attacks from Hezbollah, where it retaliated, saying that it hit Israel's Rafael advanced defense systems, which makes Iron Dome, in a location near Haifa, and also another Israeli military airbase. There were some civilian communities hit in Israel, in Kiryat Bialik near Haifa. We are just seeing an escalation. This last week has just been a new phase in this war. We're seeing both sides just hitting harder, deeper, and Israel's trying to send a message that a solution has to be reached, or it's going to push to what could be war, which could be really devastating to both sides. It's unclear if Hezbollah is going to accept that.
But Anat, from what we understand, we heard from the Israeli president. We've also heard from Lebanon as well that the last thing anybody wants is a full-out war between between Hezbollah and the IDF. So have both sides given each other enough room to de-escalate the situation?
Yeah, it's not clear how this is going to happen. I can tell you that there's a lot of pressure here in Israel from, on both sides of the border. Tens of thousands of civilians have been evacuated from their homes as a result of the fighting. In Israel, the residents of the north are putting a lot of pressure on the government, telling them, come up with a solution for us. And, there's a lot of push to go towards a war, but this could be devastating. It's unclear if Hezbollah is going to back down, but it seems that Israel's decided to try to escalate, to de-escalate.
We also, of course, are coming up to 1 year since the October 7th attack. And with what has been going on in northern Israel, we are not hearing much about what's happening in Gaza. So, Anat, is that conversation now been sidetracked, or is that still on the Israeli government's priority list? Because, of course, the two are connected.
Definitely. I think that's a great question. I'll tell you one thing, the hostage families who are fighting and trying to keep this on the agenda feel that the government has kind of left their relatives behind as a result of moving on to the north. But this is an issue. Israel's fighting on multiple fronts. It's fighting Hezbollah, it's fighting in the West Bank, it's fighting in Gaza, and it also has, projectiles coming from Iraq and from Yemen. And so it's kind of, risks spreading thin. And there's a lot of people saying that, we're splitting attention, but the government says it's aimed towards its war goals, and those include, defeating Hamas and retrieving the hostages.
In further escalations now between Hezbollah and the IDF, are they observing rules of restraint in your view at the moment, or are we going to see more attacks like we saw with the pagers and the walkie-talkies?
Right. It's sort of, there's this feeling in Israel that sort of the red lines have been crossed in terms of Israel's attacks in Lebanon. It's really hitting in the Dakhia and Beirut. It's doing things that it wouldn't have done before. Hezbollah has deepened its attacks in retaliation, but still is saying that it's hitting military targets. So it hasn't escalated as much, which what seems to be, some sort of signaling to avoid a larger war. With Israel, it's hard to know what's coming next. We have to see. Just on Friday, we had a huge strike that, killed Ibrahim Akil, a top Hezbollah leader.
What's happening to the residents in northern Israel? Have they been relocated? Have they been put in enough safe distance from the Hezbollah rockets, or are the targets so unpredictable?
Yeah, so Hezbollah's targeting has been limited to a certain amount of kilometers from the border, and all of those towns that are really in that range have been
Mhm.
evacuated. So
Right.
they're in hotels in the center of the country, elsewhere. Now we're starting to see that spread a bit more, and those communities have not been evacuated. So what Israel did, Israel's Home Front Command, which is responsible for instructions to the public, basically has said that anyone in the range of Haifa and upwards, northwards, is basically having to be near a shelter, and they put restrictions on gatherings of people. So they're trying to limit the damage, and they're telling people to be around the shelters because they're going to have to keep running to the shelters.
And I know you're speaking to us from Tel Aviv. What's life like in Tel Aviv right now?
The strange thing is that life in Tel Aviv is pretty normal. That's the weird thing about this country right now. It's kind of shrunk in space. So if you go up north, life is not normal. A lot of people are evacuated. There's no tourism anywhere right now. But life in Tel Aviv is still quite bustling. Restaurants are hard to book. But then you go to the south, and it's also similar. So it just sort of feels like the living space has shrunk a little bit. Yeah, I think there's just a bit of gloominess and about what's going on, and people feel a bit stuck.
And lastly, focusing on the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, how sustainable is it for him to have two fronts, one in northern Israel, one in southern Israel, and of course the ongoing operations in Gaza? What does that do to his political standing, his popularity among the Israeli people, and of course the relationship with the US, who have made it abundantly clear that they also do not want to see full-on engagement between Hezbollah and Israel?
Yeah, so Netanyahu is a very controversial leader. I think there was polling that showed that around 70% of Israelis would like him to quit. He still has not taken responsibility for the October 7th disaster, unlike the heads of intelligence and other people in the military. So there's still protests, every Saturday against him. But he's managed to survive, and he's not dropping in the polls anymore. And it sort of feels like he's kind of buying more time, maybe waiting for Trump. We don't really know what the game plan is, but yeah, right now he's surviving. We don't really see right now a scenario where people in his own party would turn against him, which is what would be needed to push him out. So, I mean, in terms of his popular, it's again, it's difficult fighting on multiple fronts. Aside the prime minister, you have an army that won't be able to fight on all fronts forever. So some decisions are going to have to be made, and some of his critics allege that he is kind of delaying decision making.
Anat, thanks for giving us your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Anat Peled, Wall Street Journal correspondent, speaking to us from Tel Aviv.